I believe that every man has a beast inside him, chained by the thin links of civilization. We think we are good people because we follow the laws, because we pay our taxes, and because we say please and thank you. But civilization is just a coat of paint on a crumbling wall. When the rain comes, the kind of rain that washes away the paint, you find out what the wall is really made of. For me, that rain started on a cold Thanksgiving afternoon in a quiet suburb of Pennsylvania. My name is Keller Dover. I was a carpenter. I spent my life building things that were meant to last. I built houses, I built furniture, I built a family. I was a man of preparation. I had a basement filled with emergency supplies, canned food, and water. I thought I was ready for any disaster. But you can't prepare for the moment the air in your lungs suddenly turns to lead. You can't prepare for the silence that follows a scream that never happened. It was 4 p.m. The light was fading into that sickly gray hue that winter brings. My daughter, Anna, and her friend, Joy, had gone outside to play. They were 6 years old. They were wearing bright coats, red and blue, like 2 little sparks of life in the dull landscape. One minute they were there, laughing near the old RV parked down the street. The next, they were gone. I want you to try and imagine that specific moment of realization. It's not an explosion. It's a slow, freezing cold that starts at the base of your spine and moves up to your brain until you can't think. You call their names. At first, you're just annoyed. Then you're worried. And then, you're terrified. You run down the street, your boots splashing in the cold mud, yelling until your throat feels like it's bleeding. But the only answer you get is the sound of the wind through the bare trees. The police arrived within 20 minutes. Detective Loki, a man with tattoos on his neck and eyes that looked like they had seen the bottom of every dark pit in the world. He talked about statistics. He talked about the first 48 hours. He talked like a man who was reading from a manual, while my heart was being ripped out of my chest by a dull blade. They found the RV. They found the driver, a boy named Alex Jones. He had the IQ of a 10-year-old. He sat in that interrogation room with a blank stare, a child trapped in a man's body. They searched his vehicle. They found nothing. No DNA, no blood, no signs of a struggle. Loki told me they had to let him go. Lack of evidence, he said. The law, he said. I stood outside the police station and watched Alex Jones walk out with his aunt. He looked at me. For a split second, the blankness in his eyes disappeared. He leaned in and whispered 6 words that changed the trajectory of my soul. They didn't cry until I left. That was the moment the chain snapped. The detective didn't hear it. The law didn't care about it. But I knew. I knew that the boy with the broken mind was holding the keys to my daughter's life. And I knew that if I waited for the system to find her, I would be burying an empty coffin. I didn't go home to console my wife. I couldn't look at her without seeing the empty chair at the dinner table. I went to my workshop. I grabbed my tools. Not the tools for building, but the tools for breaking. I followed Alex Jones. I watched him from the shadows. I waited until his aunt went to the store. I waited until he was alone, walking his dog in the drizzle. I didn't feel like a criminal when I put the bag over his head. I didn't feel like a monster when I threw him into the back of my truck. I felt like a father. I felt like a man who was finally doing the only thing that mattered. I took him to an abandoned apartment building my father had left me, a place that didn't exist on any modern map. A place where the screams would stay within the walls. I tied him to a chair in a room with no windows. I turned on a single, flickering light bulb. I looked at his face, that pale, confused face, and I asked him where they were. He didn't answer. He just whimpered. He cried like a child. "Where are they, Alex?" I asked. My voice was calm. It was the calmness of a man who had already accepted that he was going to hell. He didn't speak. I showed him a picture of Anna. He looked away. That was when I picked up the hammer. I told myself I was doing it for her. I told myself that every blow was a step closer to finding her. But as I watched the blood hit the concrete floor, a small part of me realized that I wasn't just looking for my daughter. I was punishing the world for being so cruel. I spent the next 3 days in that room. I became a ghost. I would go home, hug my wife, tell her the police were doing everything they could, and then I would go back to that basement. I created a ritual of pain. I used steam, I used ice, I used my bare hands. I transformed that boy's face into a map of my own agony. Loki was starting to suspect me. He was watching me. He saw the change in my eyes. He saw the way my knuckles were bruised. But he couldn't find the room. He was a man of the law, bound by rules and warrants. I was a man of the earth, bound by blood. On the 4th night, something shifted. Alex wasn't crying anymore. He was staring at the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He started to hum a song. A song I recognized. It was the song Anna used to sing in the bathtub. "Where did you hear that song, Alex?" I screamed, grabbing him by the throat. "Tell me. Where is she?" He looked at me, and through the swelling and the blood, he smiled. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. "The maze," he whispered. "You have to finish the maze." Every time I left that abandoned building, the world outside felt like a hallucination. The suburbs of Pennsylvania were draped in a thick, suffocating fog, as if the earth itself was trying to hide the secrets buried beneath its surface. I would drive home with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight that my joints felt like they were going to burst through the skin. I had to scrub the smell of that basement off my body before I touched my wife, Grace. I had to wash away the copper scent of blood and the damp odor of despair. Grace was falling apart. She stayed in bed, drugged on sleep medication, drifting between nightmares and a reality that was even worse. I would sit by her side, whispering lies. I told her the police were close. I told her Detective Loki had a lead. I told her our daughter was coming home for Christmas. Each word felt like a hot coal in my mouth. I was a man of God, but I was building a cathedral of sin to save my child. Meanwhile, Detective Loki was a ghost in the machine. He didn't sleep. He lived in his car, fueled by nicotine and the obsession that defines men who have seen too much. He was retracing the steps of every sex offender in the county, every drifter, every shadow. He found a man named Bob Taylor, a man who bought children's clothes at thrift stores and kept snakes in plastic bins in his house. The walls of Taylor's basement were covered in drawings of mazes. Intricate, impossible mazes that looked like they were drawn by a mind that had lost its exit. I watched Loki from the perimeter of the police tape. I saw the way he looked at the drawings. He thought he had found the answer. He thought Bob Taylor was the one. But I knew better. I had Alex Jones in my basement. I had the boy who whispered about the maze before Taylor was even a name on a police report. I went back to the apartment building. The stairs creaked under my weight, a rhythmic warning of what I had become. Alex was curled in the corner of his cage. I had built a wooden box around him, a sensory deprivation chamber that only allowed him to hear my voice and the dripping of a broken pipe. I was using a technique I'd read about in a survival manual, breaking the spirit to unlock the memory. "The maze, Alex," I whispered into the small air hole. "Show me the maze." He didn't scream anymore. His voice was a dry rattle. "He won't let me out until I finish it," he said. "The man with the hidden face. He hides the girls in the center. But the center is moving." I felt a jolt of electricity run through me. Who is the man with the hidden face? Is it Bob Taylor? Alex laughed. It was a sound that belonged in a cemetery. Bob is just a mapper. He's looking for the way out. But there is no way out. We're all in the pit, Keller. You're in the pit too. Can't you feel the walls closing in? I kicked the box, the sound booming like a cannon in the empty room. I was losing my mind. I started seeing mazes everywhere, in the cracks of the sidewalk, in the patterns of the frost on my windshield, in the veins of my own hands. I was becoming part of the mystery I was trying to solve. Loki caught up with me in a diner at 3 a.m. He sat across from me, his eyes rimmed with red, his tattoos hidden under his coat. He didn't order food. He just looked at me. I know what you're doing, Keller, he said quietly. I know you have him. I know you think you're the hero of this story. Every time a father tries to do my job, a child ends up in a hole that no one ever finds. Give him to me. Let the law handle it. The law is a fence that the wolves jump over whenever they want, Loki, I replied. I'm not a hero. I'm just a man who wants his daughter back. If you want to arrest me, do it. But unless you have those girls in your car, stay out of my way. Loki leaned in, his voice a low growl. Bob Taylor killed himself in the interrogation room today. He drew a maze on the table with his own blood before he did it. Does that sound like a man who was working alone? You're chasing a ghost, Keller. And the boy in your basement is just a distraction. I stood up and walked out. I didn't care about Bob Taylor. I didn't care about the law. I went back to the basement, but this time, I didn't use the hammer. I sat down on the floor next to the box. I talked to Alex as if he were my own son. I told him about Anna. I told him about the way she liked her toast burnt, the way she used to hide under the kitchen table when it thundered. And then, Alex spoke. Not in his childish voice, but in a voice that was cold and clear. He lives in the house with the cross made of bones, he said. The priest who isn't a priest. He has the whistle. Anna's whistle. I froze. The whistle. Anna had a red emergency whistle I'd given her. She never took it off. If Alex knew about the whistle, he wasn't just a witness. He was a participant. Or a victim who had been forced to watch. I drove to the local church, a crumbling Gothic structure on the edge of town. I found the priest, a man named Father Patrick, in the rectory. He was an alcoholic, a man who had lost his faith in the bottle. I didn't ask questions. I threw him against the wall and searched the house. In the basement of the rectory, I found it. A hidden door behind a rack of communion wine. And inside was a sight that made the world turn upside down. A body. A mummified body of a man sitting in a chair, tied with heavy chains. Around his neck was a necklace made of small, carved wooden mazes. I realized then that the maze wasn't just a game. It was a religion. A war against God. The body in the priest's basement wasn't just a corpse, it was a message. A silent, decaying witness to a war I didn't know was being fought. The priest, Father Patrick, sat on the floor, weeping and smelling of cheap gin. He told me the man in the chair had come to him years ago. He had confessed to a sin so black that it had extinguished the light in the priest's soul. The man had boasted about killing 16 children. He said he was waging a war against God, trying to turn people into demons like him by taking away their most precious things. The priest had killed him. Not out of justice, but out of fear. And then he had locked the door and tried to drink the memory away. But the man's legacy didn't die with him. The maze was still out there. The invisible architecture of pain was still claiming victims. I left the rectory and drove back to the abandoned building, my mind spinning like a broken compass. I looked at Alex Jones through the hole in the wooden box. His eyes were vacant, but his words were sharp as glass. "The center is moving, Keller," he whispered. "You're looking for a person, but you should be looking for a house. The house with the woman who lost her child to the maze first." I realized then that I had been blind. I had been so focused on the boy that I hadn't looked at the woman who guarded him. Holly Jones. Alex's aunt. I drove to her house, a small, unremarkable bungalow that smelled of lavender and old newspapers. The Christmas lights were blinking in the window, a cheerful lie in the face of the darkness outside. Holly invited me in. She offered me tea. She talked about her late husband, a man who had disappeared years ago after their own son had died of cancer. She looked like a grandmother. She looked like the kind of woman who baked cookies for the neighborhood kids. But as I sat on her sofa, I saw it. On the wall, half hidden by a framed picture of a landscape, was a small, red plastic whistle. My heart didn't just beat, it hammered against my ribs like a trapped animal. That whistle belonged to my daughter. "That's a nice whistle, Holly," I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from a long distance. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She just smiled that same kind, empty smile. "It was Alex's," she said. "He found it in the park. He's always finding things." I knew she was lying. I knew this was the center of the maze. I reached for my pocket, for the gun I had taken from the workshop, but she was faster. I felt a sharp sting in my neck. A needle. I tried to stand, but my legs turned to water. The room began to tilt. "You're a good father, Keller," she whispered as I fell to the floor. "That's why you were chosen. The man in the priest's basement, he was my husband. We've been doing his work for a long time. Turning people like you into people like us. Making you realize that God doesn't listen to the screams of children. Only we do." She led me, dragging my limp body, to the backyard. There, hidden under a patch of dead grass and a heavy plywood board, was a hole. A deep, narrow pit in the earth. She threw me in like a bag of trash. "The girls are close, Keller," she said, looking down at me from the edge. "But you'll never see them. You'll just be another ghost in the maze." She slammed the board shut and piled earth on top of it. I was buried alive. The silence was absolute. It was the silence of the grave. I lay there in the dark, the air getting thin, my hands clawing at the dirt. I felt something cold near my fingers. A piece of fabric. I pulled at it, and my heart stopped. It was a red coat. Anna's coat. I wasn't alone in the hole. Meanwhile, Detective Loki was at the police station, staring at a photo of Holly Jones's husband. He had found a match in the cold case files. The man was a known kidnapper who had vanished 20 years ago. Loki realized that the aunt wasn't a relative at all. She was the architect. He sped toward her house, his tires screaming on the wet asphalt. He didn't wait for backup. He burst through the front door just as Holly was preparing another needle. A struggle broke out, a desperate, violent scramble in the kitchen. Loki was shot in the shoulder, the blood staining his shirt, but he managed to fire back. Holly fell. But the house was silent. He couldn't find the girls. He searched every room, every closet, every inch of the basement. He went into the backyard, his flashlight cutting through the fog. He stood over the patch of dead grass, his breath ragged. He heard it then. A faint, rhythmic sound. Not a scream. Not a cry. It was the sound of a whistle. A red emergency whistle, being blown with the last bit of air in a father's lungs. Loki began to dig. He dug with his bare hands, the dirt getting under his fingernails, the blood from his shoulder dripping into the earth. He pulled back the plywood board and saw them. 2 little girls, huddled together in the corner of the pit, and a man, covered in mud and blood, holding a whistle to his lips. I looked up into the light of Loki's flashlight. I saw the man of the law, the man I had hated, reaching down to save us. I saw my daughter's face, pale but alive. I didn't try to get out. I just handed him Anna. "Take her," I whispered. The girls were saved. The maze was broken. But as the sirens filled the air and the paramedics rushed toward the pit, I knew that I couldn't walk back into the light. I had done things in that abandoned building that could never be undone. I had become the monster to find the monster. The credits of the world would roll, the news would call it a miracle, but for me, the maze would always be there. In every shadow, in every silence, in every steady beat of my own heart. I closed my eyes and listened to the sound of my daughter's voice. It was the only music I ever needed to hear again. And as the darkness finally took me, I knew that for one brief, shining moment, the beast inside me had finally found its peace.